Come closer. I have a story for you tonight. One that kept me up past midnight when I first discovered it. It's about a woman who spent 11 years watching younger sisters, cousins, and friends walk down the aisle, while society slowly, methodically erased her from the list of marriageable women. And about the most powerful Duke in England, who watched 200 debutantes parade before him season after season, and found every single one of them wanting, because he was waiting for something they could never give him. This is the Duke's revenge, and I'm so glad you're here. Tell me, where in the world am I reaching you tonight? Whether you're in bed, on a train, cooking dinner, or hiding from responsibilities, drop your location and your local time below. I love knowing who's listening. Now, it's important to understand what it meant to be unmarried at 29 in 1847 England. The London season functioned as a marriage market operating on ruthless economic principles. Families invested thousands of pounds in gowns, carriages, and townhouse rentals, all for the chance to parade their daughters before eligible men. A young woman typically had 3 seasons to secure a match. After that, she began to be whispered about as on the shelf, a spinster, a failure, a burden on her family. By 23, a woman was past her prime marriageable age. By 25, she was considered virtually unmarriageable. By 29, she had ceased to exist entirely in the eyes of polite society. Honoria Bellingham had just turned 29. And tonight, at Lady Ashcroft's winter ball, she would discover that everything she believed about her own worthlessness was about to be rewritten by a man who had refused every woman in England, and who had been waiting, with the patience of a predator, for her to finally become exactly what he needed. Our tale begins in the frozen December of 1847, when the chandeliers of Ashcroft House blazed with 10,000 candles and the snow fell like ash outside the frost-rimmed windows. The ballroom was a symphony of light and color, silk gowns swirling like exotic flowers beneath crystal chandeliers that scattered rainbows across the crowd. The air was thick with the competing scents of expensive perfume and fresh-cut flowers, and the warmth of 1,000 candles pressed against Honoria's skin like an unwelcome embrace. Footmen in powdered wigs glided between guests with silver trays of champagne, and the orchestra played a waltz so beautiful it made her heart ache for things she had long since stopped allowing herself to want. Honoria Bellingham stood at the edge of it all, positioned precisely where she had stood, at every ball, for the past 11 years. Close enough to the wall to be invisible, far enough from the refreshment table to avoid being mistaken for a servant. She had perfected the art of disappearing in plain sight over the years, through trial and error and countless humiliations that had slowly, painfully taught her the rules of survival. Her gown was dove gray, elegant but unremarkable, chosen specifically to avoid drawing attention. The fabric was good quality but not showy, the cut flattering but not provocative, the color chosen to blend with the shadows rather than catch the candlelight. Her dark hair was pinned simply, no elaborate curls or diamond-studded combs to catch the light. At 18, she had dressed to be noticed, spending hours with her maid selecting ribbons and accessories that might draw a gentleman's eye. At 29, she dressed to be overlooked. It was easier that way. There you are, darling. Her mother materialized at her elbow, champagne glass in hand, disappointment etched into every line of her face. I've just been speaking with Lady Thornton, her youngest daughter, the plain one with the unfortunate nose, has secured an engagement to Viscount Harrington's second son. Can you imagine? Even she managed to find someone. The unspoken comparison hung in the air between them, like smoke from a guttering candle. How wonderful for her, Honoria said, her voice carefully neutral. Wonderful. Her mother's laugh was brittle as winter ice. Yes, wonderful that a girl half your age with half your accomplishments has done what you have spectacularly failed to do for over a decade. Your father is beside himself, you know. Another season, another £1,000 spent. Another year of watching you stand in corners like a piece of furniture. Honoria had long since stopped feeling the sting of such words. They had lost their power somewhere around her 24th birthday, when she had finally accepted that she would never be what her family wanted her to be. She was too tall, too quiet, too intelligent for the marriage market. Her wit was too sharp, her opinions too firm, her willingness to feign empty-headed admiration for boring men non-existent. Perhaps I should simply stop attending these events, Honoria suggested mildly. It would save everyone the embarrassment. Don't be ridiculous. What would people say? Her mother's eyes were already scanning the crowd, searching for more successful mothers to compete with. No, you'll continue to attend, and you'll continue to smile, and perhaps, some widower with poor eyesight and lower standards might still take pity on you. Though at your age, even that seems increasingly unlikely. She swept away in a rustle of silk, leaving Honoria alone with the familiar weight of inadequacy pressing against her chest. 29 years old, 11 seasons, 0 proposals. The mathematics of her failure were brutally simple, a ledger she had balanced countless times in the privacy of her own mind. She had danced with hundreds of men, made polite conversation with thousands, smiled until her face ached at countless balls and dinner parties and morning calls. And not once, not a single time in 11 years, had any man looked at her and seen something worth claiming. She was, as her cousin Patience had so kindly pointed out last week, at a family dinner, where everyone seemed determined to remind Honoria of her failures, expired goods. Milk left too long in the sun, fruit that had rotted on the vine while everyone waited for something better. Honoria turned her attention to the dancers, watching younger women, girls really, barely out of the schoolroom with ribbons still in their hair, twirl in the arms of eligible men who saw them as fresh and desirable. How strange it was to remember when she had been one of them, full of hope and expectation, certain that love and marriage awaited her just around the corner. How naive she had been, how desperately, painfully naive. The orchestra shifted into a new waltz, the music swelling with romantic promise, and the crowd parted slightly. And that was when Honoria first saw him. He stood across the ballroom like a dark pillar among the colorful swirl of dancers, utterly still while everyone else moved around him. Tall, taller than any man she had ever seen, with shoulders broad enough to block out the light from the chandeliers behind him. His hair was dark, almost black, swept back from a face that seemed carved from granite. Sharp cheekbones, a jaw that could have been used to split firewood, eyes the color of storm clouds gathering over the Yorkshire moors. He was not handsome. He was something far more dangerous than handsome. He was magnetic, arresting, the kind of man who made other men seem like boys playing dress-up and made women forget how to breathe. And he was staring directly at her. Honoria's heart stuttered. She glanced behind her, certain he must be looking at someone else. One of the diamond-bright debutantes, perhaps, or a beautiful young widow. But there was only the wall at her back, cold and solid. And when she turned forward again, his eyes were still fixed on her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. She knew who he was. Everyone knew who he was. Gideon Mercer, the 7th Duke of Stanhope, the wealthiest man in England, the most sought-after bachelor the Ton had ever produced, and according to every gossip column and whispered rumor, the most impossible man to please in the entire British Empire. 200 women. That was the number the scandal sheets bandied about. 200 titled, beautiful, accomplished young women had been presented to the Duke of Stanhope over the past decade, and he had rejected every single one of them without explanation or apology. Earls' daughters, viscounts' sisters, even a foreign princess. All had been found wanting by his impossible standards. Society had theories, of course. He was secretly in love with a woman who had died. He preferred the company of men. He was so wealthy, he simply didn't need to marry. He was mad, broken, cursed by some ancient family tragedy that had turned him against the feminine sex entirely. Whatever. The reason, the Duke of Stanhope did not marry, did not court, did not dance or flirt or give any woman reason to hope. He appeared at social events like a ghost, watched the proceedings with those cold gray eyes, and departed without speaking to anyone of consequence, until tonight. Because tonight, he was walking toward Honoria Bellingham, the expired spinster in the corner, the invisible woman, the failure of 11 seasons, and the crowd was parting before him like the Red Sea before Moses, and everyone was staring, and Honoria could not seem to make her lungs work properly. He stopped before her. This close, she could see that his eyes were not simply gray, they were silver, flecked with darker shards of slate that caught the candlelight and reflected it back like mirrors. He smelled of sandalwood and winter wind, of cold stone and old forests, and his presence was so overwhelming that Honoria felt small for the first time in her life, though she had always been too tall for fashion. "Miss Bellingham." His voice was deep, rough-edged, as though he did not use it often enough for it to have smoothed itself into politeness. It was not a question. He knew exactly who she was. The sound of her name on his lips sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the ballroom. No one spoke her name like that, as though it mattered, as though she mattered. "Your Grace," she curtsied, muscle memory taking over when her mind had apparently abandoned her entirely. "I was not aware we had been introduced. We haven't." He did not move to remedy this oversight, did not offer the polite platitudes that social convention demanded. Instead, he continued to study her face with that unnerving intensity, as though cataloging every feature, every line, every imperfection for later examination. His eyes traced the arch of her brows, the curve of her lips, the slight asymmetry of her jaw that had always made her self-conscious in portraits. Most men, when they looked at women, looked at parts, bust, waist, face, evaluating each component like pieces of a horse at auction. But the Duke was looking at her as a whole, as a complete person, and the experience was so foreign that Honoria didn't know how to respond. "Dance with me." It was not a request. It was not even really an invitation. It was a statement of intent, delivered with the absolute certainty of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. Around them, the ballroom had gone unnaturally quiet. Honoria could feel hundreds of eyes boring into her back, could sense the shock and outrage rippling through the crowd like waves from a stone thrown into still water. The Duke of Stanhope did not dance. The Duke of Stanhope did not ask spinsters to dance. The Duke of Stanhope did not acknowledge the existence of women like Honoria Bellingham. Conversations had stopped mid-sentence. Dancers had stumbled in their steps. Lady Ashcroft herself had paused with a champagne glass halfway to her lips, her expression frozen somewhere between horror and fascination. And yet here he was, his gloved hand extended toward her, waiting. Honoria hesitated. Every instinct honed by 11 years of social survival screamed at her to refuse, to make some polite excuse about a turned ankle or a promised dance, to fade back into the invisibility that had protected her for so long. Whatever this was, whatever game the Duke was playing, it could only end badly for her. Men like him did not notice women like her without ulterior motives, but his eyes held hers, and in their silver depths, she saw something that made her breath catch. Not cruelty, not mockery, not the pitying condescension she had learned to expect from men who deigned to acknowledge her existence. He was looking at her as though he had been searching for something his entire life and had finally, impossibly, found it. Honoria placed her hand in his. The contact, even through 2 layers of gloves, sent a shock through her system like lightning striking dry wood. His fingers closed around hers, firm and possessive, and he led her onto the dance floor without another word as the orchestra struck up a waltz that seemed to have been waiting for precisely this moment. Dancing with the Duke of Stanhope was nothing like dancing with other men. Other men held her at a polite distance, maintained the prescribed space between their bodies, guided her through the steps with impersonal efficiency. The Duke pulled her close, scandalously close, until she could feel the heat of his body through her gown, until his breath stirred the fine hairs at her temple, until the rest of the ballroom dissolved into a blur of color and light that meant nothing compared to the man in her arms. He danced like he did everything else, with absolute control, absolute confidence, absolute command. She had no choice but to follow, swept along in his wake like a leaf in a river current, trusting him to guide her through the turns and dips without conscious thought. "You're wondering why," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. Among other things, Honoria was surprised to find her voice worked at all. "You've refused every woman in England for 10 years, Your Grace. Forgive me if I find your sudden interest in the most ineligible woman at this ball somewhat perplexing. The most ineligible." Something flickered in those silver eyes. Amusement, perhaps, or something sharper. "Is that what you think you are?" "It's what I know I am. 29 years old, 11 failed seasons, no fortune to speak of, no particular beauty, and a reputation for being too intelligent for my own good." Honoria met his gaze without flinching. "I am the definition of ineligible, Your Grace. Whatever game you're playing, I assure you I'm not worth the effort." And yet I disagree. The words were simple, spoken without emphasis, but they hit Honoria like a physical blow. She stumbled slightly, and his arm tightened around her waist, steadying her, holding her even closer. "You disagree," she repeated carefully. "With what, precisely?" "With all of it." He spun her through a turn, graceful and controlled. "You are not ineligible. You are not expired. You are not worthless, or plain, or too intelligent. You are exactly, precisely, what I have been waiting for." Honoria stared at him. The chandelier light caught the sharp planes of his face, casting half of it in shadow, and she realized with a start that he was entirely serious. Whatever madness had seized the Duke of Stanhope, he believed what he was saying. "You don't know me," she said slowly. "We've never spoken before tonight. We've never even been in the same room to my knowledge. Haven't we?" A ghost of a smile crossed his features. Not warm, exactly, but not cold either. Something in between, something private, something that made her heart race against her will. "I've known you for 7 years, Miss Bellingham. I've watched you at 37 balls, 19 dinner parties, 12 garden parties, and one very memorable opera, where you fell asleep during the second act and snored quite delicately into your glove." Honoria felt the blood drain from her face. That's not possible. I would have noticed if you were watching me. Someone would have said something." Would they? A man standing in shadows, invisible to a society that has already dismissed him as a lost cause? A woman doing the same, having long since accepted her own irrelevance? His voice dropped lower, intimate and intense. "We have been invisible together, Miss Bellingham, for 7 years. The only difference is that I knew I was watching you. You had no idea I was there." The waltz ended. The final notes of the music hung in the air like a question, and Honoria became suddenly, painfully aware that the entire ballroom had stopped to watch them. Whispers rose like a tide. She could hear fragments of her own name mixed with shock and disbelief, and, from some quarters, barely concealed envy. The Duke of Stanhope had danced. For the first time in 10 years, the Duke of Stanhope had taken a woman in his arms and waltzed with her in full view of London society. And that woman was Honoria Bellingham, the spinster everyone had written off years ago. "I don't understand," she breathed. "Why me? Why now?" "Because you're ready." He released her from the dance hold, but kept her hand in his, making no move to lead her off the floor. Around them, couples had stopped mid-step. The orchestra had trailed into confused silence, and every eye in the ballroom was fixed on the impossible scene unfolding before them. Because you've finally stopped believing in fairy tales and started seeing the world as it actually is. Because you've learned to survive disappointment without becoming bitter, to maintain your dignity without becoming cold. Because you've become exactly the woman I knew you would become, given time. Given time. Honoria's voice came out sharper than she intended, partly from shock and partly from a rising anger she didn't fully understand. You make it sound as though you've been waiting for me, like produce at market. Perhaps I have. He smiled then, really smiled, and it transformed his face into something almost beautiful. Not soft, exactly, but alive in a way his stern features usually concealed. They call you expired, don't they? Spoiled goods, past your prime. But they don't understand. He leaned close, his lips nearly brushing her ear, and whispered words that would haunt her for the rest of her life. I wasn't waiting for a green girl fresh from the schoolroom, desperate to please and empty of substance. I was waiting for you to ripen. The word struck her like a physical blow. Ripen, as though she were a fruit that had needed time to sweeten, to develop, to become worth tasting. It should have offended her. It should have made her pull away, slap his face, storm out of the ballroom in righteous fury at the presumption, the arrogance, the sheer audacity of this man who thought he could speak to her as though he knew her, as though he had any right to judge her readiness for anything. Instead, something inside her chest cracked open, and for the first time in 11 years, Honoria Bellingham felt seen. Not assessed and found wanting, not evaluated and dismissed, not measured against an impossible standard of youth and beauty and marriageable potential. Seen as a person, as a woman, as someone worth waiting for. "You're mad," she said, but her voice trembled. "Perhaps." He brought her gloved hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. Scandalous, possessive, a declaration as clear as any words. The gesture sent a ripple of gasps through the watching crowd, but he seemed not to notice or care. His eyes remained fixed on hers, burning with an intensity that made her feel exposed in ways that had nothing to do with clothing. "But I'm also the Duke of Stanhope, and I've decided that you're going to marry me, and I always get what I want." The ballroom erupted. Honoria barely registered the chaos that followed. Her mother's shriek of disbelief, her father's stammered confusion, the cascade of shocked exclamations from every corner of the room. She was too busy staring at the Duke, searching his face for some sign of mockery, some hint that this was all an elaborate joke at her expense. She found nothing but absolute certainty. "You can't simply decide something like that," she managed. "Marriage isn't a business transaction." "Isn't it?" He tucked her hand into the crook of his arm and began leading her toward the French doors that opened onto Lady Ashcroft's snow-covered terrace. A man offers his name, his protection, his wealth. A woman offers her companionship, her body, her ability to produce heirs. Both parties calculate the benefits and drawbacks and make their choice accordingly. That is precisely what a business transaction looks like. That's the most unromantic thing I've ever heard. I'm not offering you romance, Miss Bellingham. He pushed open the doors, and a blast of winter air struck her face, sharp and clean after the overheated ballroom. I'm offering you something far more valuable. I'm offering you the truth. They stepped onto the terrace, and the Duke closed the doors behind them, shutting out the noise and the stares and the scandal they had just ignited. Snow lay thick on the stone balustrade, and the garden beyond was a fairy kingdom of white, moonlight turning each crystal branch into silver. It was, Honoria thought distantly, exactly the sort of romantic setting that novels promised and real life never delivered. The truth, she repeated, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold. She had not thought to grab her shawl, and the thin silk of her gown offered no protection against December's bite. And what truth is that, Your Grace? That I have been watching you for 7 years, that I have studied you, learned you, waited for you with a patience that borders on obsession. He shrugged off his coat and draped it over her shoulders before she could protest, the fabric still warm from his body, smelling of sandalwood and him. That I have refused 200 women because not one of them was you. That's not truth. That's madness. Perhaps there is no difference. He moved to stand before her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. You want to know why I waited? Why I rejected every simpering debutante, every calculated match, every woman that Tun tried to force upon me? I'll tell you. He paused, and something in his expression shifted. A crack in the granite, a glimpse of something raw beneath. Because I didn't want a wife who would love me for my title. I didn't want a woman who would simper and flatter and tell me what I wanted to hear because she was terrified of losing my wealth and protection. I wanted someone who had learned to survive without those things. Someone who had been tested by disappointment and emerged unbroken. Someone who would look at me and see a man, not a coronet. Honoria's breath caught. And you think I'm that woman? I know you are. He reached up and brushed a snowflake from her hair, his touch impossibly gentle for a man who radiated such intensity. I watched you, Honoria. Season after season, I watched you smile through your mother's cruelty and your father's indifference. I watched you maintain your dignity when lesser women would have crumbled. I watched you refuse to become bitter, refuse to become desperate, refuse to compromise yourself for a match that would have made you miserable. Do you know how rare that is? Do you have any idea what you've accomplished by simply surviving? No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever looked at the last 11 years of her life and seen anything but failure. And here was this man, this impossible, infuriating, beautiful man, telling her that her survival was not a consolation prize, but a victory. Telling her that he had been watching, waiting, wanting her all along. You're asking me to believe something extraordinary, she said carefully. You're asking me to believe that the most sought-after man in England spent 7 years waiting for the most overlooked woman in England to become what he needed. That defies all logic. It does. He smiled, and it was a terrible smile, full of sharp edges and dark promises. But then, I have never been particularly logical where you are concerned. Now, it's important to understand what was happening in this moment, what Honoria could not possibly have known. The Duke of Stanhope had not simply noticed her at a ball 7 years ago and decided to wait. His obsession had far deeper roots than that, tangled in history and grief and a promise, made to a dying woman. 7 years earlier, Gideon Mercer had knelt at his mother's deathbed and listened to her final words. She had been a remarkable woman, the former Duchess of Stanhope, intelligent, witty, possessed of an iron will that had terrified society and captivated her husband until his dying day. Her marriage had been legendary, a love match in an era when such things were considered vulgar, a partnership of equals in a world that demanded female submission. Gideon had grown up watching his parents dance in the library after the servants had gone to bed, had heard them debating politics and philosophy with the passionate intensity of longtime adversaries who also happened to be lovers. He had seen the way his father looked at his mother, not with possession or pride, but with wonder, even after 30 years of marriage, and he had known from a very young age that he would accept nothing less for himself. "Promise me," his mother had whispered on her deathbed, her hand cold and fragile in his. The illness had wasted her body, but her eyes were clear, fierce with determination even in her final hours. "Promise me you won't settle. Promise me you'll wait for someone worth having, even if it takes your whole life. Promise me you'll find what your father and I had." "I promise," he had said, and the words had carried the weight of sacred vow. He had promised, and for 3 years he had searched, growing increasingly desperate, as one empty-headed debutante after another paraded before him, each more vapid and calculating than the last. They simpered, they flattered. They wore low-cut gowns and laughed at jokes they didn't understand, and made it painfully clear that they saw him as nothing more than a title to be acquired, a fortune to be spent. He had begun to believe that what his parents had found was a miracle never to be repeated, that he would die alone because no woman alive could meet the standards his mother had set. And then he had seen Honoria Bellingham. She had been 22 in her 5th season, already beginning to be whispered about as past her prime. He had watched her stand at the edge of a ballroom, ignored by the men who should have been fighting for her attention, dismissed by the women who should have recognized her worth. And he had seen, in the set of her shoulders, in the calm acceptance in her eyes, in the quiet dignity with which she bore her mother's cutting remarks, exactly what his own mother had possessed. Strength, intelligence, the ability to withstand suffering without being destroyed by it. She had not been ready then, still too hopeful, still believing that the right man might appear to rescue her. But Gideon had known, with a certainty that bordered on prophecy, that one day she would be. One day she would stop waiting to be saved and start saving herself. One day she would become the woman he needed her to be. So he had waited, year after year, season after season, refusing every match the ton tried to force upon him, watching Honoria Bellingham slowly, painfully transform from a hopeful girl into a remarkable woman. He had watched her learn to protect her heart, watched her develop the sharp wit that kept fools at bay, watched her become strong and self-sufficient, and utterly, completely herself. And when she had finally stopped hoping for rescue, when she had finally accepted her place on the shelf with grace instead of despair, he had known the time had come. Tonight, watching her stand in her gray gown with her invisible armor wrapped around her, he had finally seen what 7 years of waiting had created. A woman who expected nothing from the world, who would never beg or simper or manipulate, who would look at a duke and see only a man, a woman worth having, a woman worth claiming. "I don't expect you to believe me," Gideon said now, watching the play of moonlight across her face. "I don't expect you to trust me. I have given you no reason to do either. But I am asking you to consider the possibility, just the possibility, that I am telling the truth. That somewhere in this cruel, calculating world, there is a man who has seen you clearly and wants you anyway. Not despite your failures, Miss Bellingham, because of them." Honoria's eyes were bright, though whether with unshed tears or simply the reflection of the snow, Gideon could not tell. And if I refuse, if I decide that your attention is unwanted, your proposal insulting, your entire approach offensive beyond measure, then I will withdraw. He said it simply, without heat or hurt. I am not in the habit of forcing unwilling women into anything. If you tell me to leave you alone, I will do so, and you will never hear from me again. But before you make that choice, I want you to answer one question honestly. She lifted her chin, a spark of her characteristic fire returning. Ask. When was the last time anyone looked at you the way I am looking at you now? The question hung in the frozen air between them. Honoria opened her mouth to respond, to offer some clever deflection, some cutting remark that would push him away and protect her heart from this impossible, terrifying thing happening between them. But the words wouldn't come, because the truth was that no one had ever looked at her this way. Not once in 29 years. Not with hunger and admiration, and something that might, in the right light, have been love. She had been looked at with pity, with dismissal, with calculating assessment, and found wanting. But never, never, with the particular intensity that burned in the Duke of Stanhope's silver eyes. Never as though she were worth having. I thought not, he said softly when her silence stretched too long. Consider my proposal, Miss Bellingham, not because of what I can give you, the title, the wealth, the social standing you've been denied, but because of what you can finally stop pretending. And what is that? He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, see the individual snowflakes catching in his dark hair. That you don't want to be wanted, he breathed. That you don't lie awake at night imagining what it would feel like to have someone choose you, fight for you, claim you as their own. You've spent 11 years building walls around your heart, convincing yourself that you don't need what everyone else has. But I see through those walls, Honoria. I've been studying them for 7 years. And I know that underneath all that armor, you're starving for exactly what I'm offering. And what are you offering? Her voice came out hoarse. Everything. He cupped her face in his hands, and his palms were warm against her frozen cheeks, gentle despite the intensity in his eyes. Everything I have, everything I am, everything I can become. I'm offering you a partnership, not a prison. A marriage of equals, not master and servant. I'm offering you the chance to be seen, truly seen, for the rest of your life. And then, before she could respond, before she could think or reason or protect herself, he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was not the hesitant, respectful first kiss of a proper courtship. It was consuming, possessive, demanding, a claim staked with lips and tongue and the press of his body against hers. Honoria gasped against his mouth, her hands fisting in the lapels of the coat he had draped around her, and she felt something inside her shatter. All the walls she had built, all the armor she had worn, all the careful indifference she had cultivated to survive in a world that had no use for her. Gone, in the space of a single kiss. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathing hard, her lips swollen and her heart racing, and her entire body trembling with something that was definitely not cold. Say yes, he commanded, his forehead pressed against hers. Say yes, and I swear to you, Honoria Bellingham, you will never be invisible again. She should have said no, should have laughed in his face, walked away, protected herself from whatever madness this was. She was 29 years old, well past the age of believing in fairy tales or princes who appeared from nowhere to rescue overlooked spinsters. But she had stopped believing in fairy tales long ago, and what the Duke of Stanhope was offering her was not a fairy tale. It was something far more dangerous and far more real. A man who saw her clearly, wanted her fiercely, and was willing to claim her in front of all of English society. "Yes," she whispered, and the Duke of Stanhope smiled like a man who had just won a war he had been fighting for 7 years. The scandal, of course, was immediate and spectacular. By the time Honoria and the Duke returned to the ballroom, her lips suspiciously reddened, his eyes blazing with triumph, word had already spread to every corner of Lady Ashcroft's home, and was rapidly making its way across London through the fastest communication network known to mankind, society gossip. The Duke of Stanhope had proposed to a spinster, a 29-year-old spinster with no fortune, no exceptional beauty, no family connections worth mentioning, a woman so thoroughly on the shelf that most people had forgotten she existed entirely. It was impossible. It was unbelievable. It was, according to Honoria's mother, who had cornered her near the punch bowl, with tears of joy streaming down her face. The greatest miracle since the loaves and fishes. "My darling girl," Mrs. Bellingham sobbed, clutching at Honoria's hands with a fervor that bordered on painful. "My precious, brilliant, wonderful girl. I always knew you would make a brilliant match. I always said you just needed time to blossom. Didn't I say that, Mr. Bellingham? Didn't I always say our Honoria was destined for great things?" Honoria did not point out that her mother had, in fact, spent the better part of the evening calling her an embarrassment and comparing her unfavorably to girls with unfortunate noses. She merely nodded, smiled, and allowed herself to be paraded through the ballroom like a prize horse that had unexpectedly won the derby. The Duke watched it all with a slight smile, answering questions from curious lords with a brevity that bordered on rudeness, accepting congratulations with a nod that suggested he found the entire social ritual tedious beyond measure. But his eyes followed Honoria everywhere she went, possessive and proprietary, and whenever she caught his gaze across the crowded room, she felt that same shock of heat she had experienced on the terrace. This was real. This was happening. The Duke of Stanhope, the impossible, unreachable, legendary Duke of Stanhope, wanted to marry her. It was, she thought somewhat hysterically, entirely too much to process while sober. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The engagement was announced in the Times 3 days after Lady Ashcroft's ball, and the response was nothing short of volcanic. Letters poured in from across the country. Congratulations, disbelief, outraged queries from mothers who had been trying to snare the Duke for their own daughters. Lady Jersey sent a note dripping with so much false sweetness it practically left sugar crystals on the paper. Lady Cowper requested an audience to welcome the future Duchess to the highest echelons of society. Honoria's home, previously ignored by everyone of consequence, suddenly became the most sought-after destination in London. Calling cards accumulated on the silver tray in the entrance hall like autumn leaves, and her mother fluttered about in a constant state of barely contained hysteria, simultaneously thrilled by the attention and terrified of saying something that might ruin everything. "You mustn't be too familiar with him," Mrs. Bellingham instructed Honoria before one of the Duke's chaperoned visits. "Men lose interest in women who are too available. You must maintain an air of mystery." "Mother, he watched me for 7 years. I doubt there's much mystery left." "Don't be crude, Honoria. Just because you've somehow managed to snare a duke doesn't mean you can afford to be complacent. These things can fall apart, you know. Engagements are broken all the time." Her mother's inability to simply enjoy the situation was frustrating but unsurprising. Mrs. Bellingham had spent so long expecting disappointment that she had lost the capacity for uncomplicated happiness. Every silver lining came with an enumerated list of potential clouds. Honoria, however, found herself experiencing something she had not felt in years. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of her early seasons, when she had believed that the right dress or the right compliment might change her fortunes. This was something steadier, more grounded, the hope of a woman who had seen something real in another person's eyes and chosen to believe in it. The Duke called every afternoon without fail, arriving precisely at 3 o'clock in a black carriage that drew curtains twitching up and down the street. He sat in the Bellingham's cramped drawing room, drinking tea that was not nearly as fine as what he was accustomed to, and made conversation with Honoria while her mother hovered nearby, pretending to embroider and actually listening to every word. They talked about everything. Books. They discovered a shared passion for Gothic novels, which Honoria had always been too embarrassed to admit in polite company. Politics. She had opinions, sharp ones, that would have scandalized her mother if she had been paying proper attention. Philosophy. He had read widely and thought deeply, and he seemed genuinely interested in her perspectives, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. "You're not what I expected," Honoria told him one afternoon, 3 weeks into their engagement. "And what did you expect? Someone colder, more distant. The gossip columns make you sound like a statue come to life, beautiful but incapable of human emotion." "I'm quite capable of human emotion." His eyes met hers with that intensity that still made her breath catch. "I simply don't waste it on people who don't matter. And I matter. You matter more than anything." These conversations were always conducted under her mother's watchful eye, of course, which meant that the physical intimacy of Lady Ashcroft's terrace remained frustratingly out of reach. But there were moments. A hand held a beat too long, a gaze that lingered beyond propriety, a whispered word when her mother's attention briefly wandered, that reminded Honoria of the fire that burned beneath his controlled exterior. He wanted her. She could see it in every line of his body, every carefully restrained gesture. And the knowledge of that wanting made her feel powerful in a way she had never experienced before. One afternoon, her mother was called away to deal with a domestic crisis, something about the cook threatening to quit over an insult to her pudding, and Honoria found herself alone with the Duke for the first time since their engagement. The moment the door closed, the atmosphere in the room shifted. "Finally," he said, rising from his chair and crossing to where she sat on the settee. He did not sit beside her. Instead, he knelt before her, taking her hands in his, exactly as he had done on that snow-covered terrace. "We shouldn't," Honoria said, though she made no move to pull away. "If anyone sees, I don't care who sees." He brought her hands to his lips and kissed her knuckles, one by one. "I have waited 7 years to touch you, Honoria. Another month of chaperoned visits may actually kill me." Such dramatic language from a man who claims not to waste emotion on unworthy subjects. "You're not an unworthy subject. You're the only subject that matters." He released her hands and reached up to cup her face, his thumbs brushing along her cheekbones. "I dream about you. Do you know that? Every night since Lady Ashcroft's ball. I wake up reaching for you, and you're not there, and the emptiness is unbearable. Gideon, I know I said I was patient. I know I told you I could wait. But patience was easier when you were a dream I was working toward. Now that you're real, now that I've kissed you, held you, felt you respond to me, the waiting is torture." He kissed her then, and it was nothing like the controlled kiss on the terrace. It was desperate, hungry, the kiss of a man who had been starving for 7 years and finally been offered a feast. Honoria responded without thought, her hands fisting in his coat, pulling him closer, losing herself in the heat and pressure of his mouth against hers. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she saw something in his eyes that made her heart clench. 2 more weeks, she said softly. Just 2 more weeks until the wedding. 2 weeks might as well be 2 centuries. Then think of it as proof. She smoothed his lapels, straightening the coat she had just rumpled. You waited 7 years for me to ripen, remember? What's 2 more weeks compared to that? He laughed, the sound rough and strained. You're going to use my own words against me for the rest of our lives, aren't you? Probably. She kissed the corner of his mouth, light and teasing. It's one of my few spousal talents. The door opened, and they sprang apart just as Mrs. Bellingham returned, still muttering about the impossibility of finding good help. If she noticed her daughter's flushed cheeks or her future son-in-law's slightly disheveled appearance, she chose not to comment. But the Duke caught Honoria's eye as he took his leave that afternoon, and the promise in his gaze made her shiver with anticipation. 2 more weeks. She could survive 2 more weeks. She wasn't entirely sure she wanted to. And the gossip. Oh, the gossip. Honoria heard it everywhere. In the shops where she was suddenly treated like royalty. In the drawing rooms where she was suddenly invited. In the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever she entered a room. The theories about why the Duke had chosen her were endless and increasingly creative. She had trapped him somehow. Blackmail, perhaps, or a compromising situation orchestrated by her desperate parents. She was secretly wealthy, having hidden a fortune to avoid fortune hunters. She was not actually Honoria Bellingham at all, but some mysterious imposter who had won the Duke's heart through sorcery. The truth, that he had simply watched her for 7 years and decided she was worth having, was apparently too mundane for anyone to believe. They'll stop eventually, the Duke assured her during one of their chaperoned visits, which had become a near-daily occurrence. He had insisted on a short engagement, claiming he had already waited 7 years and refused to wait a moment longer than necessary. The wedding was set for mid-January, barely a month away. Once we're married and you've proven yourself as Duchess, the gossip will move on to fresher meat. And if I fail to prove myself, Honoria asked, if I turn out to be the disaster everyone expects? He looked at her with those silver eyes, and something in their depths made her stomach flip. You won't fail, he said simply. You've spent 11 years learning to survive in a world that wanted you to fail. Being a duchess will be child's play in comparison. But there were moments, quiet moments, when she was alone with her thoughts, when Honoria wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Not because she doubted the Duke's sincerity, that at least seemed genuine, even if his methods were unconventional, but because she had spent so long building walls around her heart, and now those walls were crumbling, and she did not know who she would be without them. She had learned not to hope, learned not to expect, learned to find contentment in the margins, to take satisfaction in small victories, to survive without needing anyone's approval or affection. And now, here was this man, offering her everything she had trained herself to stop wanting, and she was terrified. Terrified that she wanted it too much. Terrified that she would lose herself in it. Terrified that one morning she would wake up and discover it had all been a dream, and she would be back in that ballroom, invisible and overlooked, watching life happen to other people while she faded into the wallpaper. The Duke seemed to sense her fear, though she never spoke of it directly. He was relentlessly, deliberately patient with her, never pushing, never demanding, simply present. He sent flowers every morning, not roses or lilies, or any of the predictable choices, but wild flowers gathered from the countryside around his estate, each arrangement accompanied by a note that referenced something she had said, or done, or thought that he had somehow noticed. Purple heather, one note read, for the color you wore to the Worthington Ball in 1842, when you stood by the window and watched the rain for an hour without speaking to anyone. You looked like you were dreaming of somewhere far away. Bluebells, read another, "for your sister's wedding," when you caught the bouquet and immediately handed it to the nearest footman. Your face suggested you would rather have eaten the flowers than kept them. Each note was a reminder that he had been watching, studying, learning her for years. That his interest was not sudden or superficial, but deep-rooted and documented. That she had not been invisible after all, at least not to him. It was, she realized slowly, the strangest and most effective courtship she could have imagined. 2 weeks before the wedding, the Duke took her to see Stanhope Park. The estate was massive, larger than anything Honoria had imagined, stretching across thousands of acres of rolling English countryside. The house itself was a Georgian masterpiece, all pale stone and symmetrical windows and manicured gardens that would be spectacular in spring. But it was the interior that took her breath away. Room after room of accumulated wealth and taste, artwork and antiques and libraries stacked floor to ceiling with books she immediately wanted to explore. "It's yours now," the Duke said, watching her face as she trailed her fingers along the spine of a first-edition Shakespeare. "All of it. The house, the land, the staff, the collections. Everything that belongs to Stanhope belongs to you." "I don't know how to be a duchess," Honoria confessed, her voice small in the cavernous library. "I don't know how to manage an estate this size, or host balls for hundreds of guests, or navigate the political complexities of your position. I've spent my whole life being overlooked. I have no idea how to be on this. No one does at first." He came to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders brushed. "My mother was a vicar's daughter from a village so small it didn't appear on most maps. She had no training, no preparation, no family connections. And she became the most beloved Duchess of Stanhope in 100 years. Do you know how?" Honoria shook her head. She refused to pretend to be something she wasn't. He turned to face her, his expression serious. She didn't try to imitate the duchesses who came before her or mold herself to society's expectations. She simply was herself, fiercely, unapologetically herself. And eventually, society had no choice but to accept her on her own terms. And you think I can do the same? I think you've been doing it for 11 years. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and the gentle intimacy of the gesture made her shiver. You refused to become bitter, even when you had every right. You refused to compromise yourself for a loveless match. You refused to let them break you, no matter how hard they tried. That stubbornness, that quiet, relentless refusal to surrender, is exactly what a Duchess of Stanhope needs. He kissed her then, slow and deep, and Honoria felt the last of her resistance crumble. Maybe she didn't know how to be a duchess. Maybe she would make mistakes, stumble, embarrass herself in front of people who were waiting for her to fail. But she would have him. This strange, intense, obsessive man who had watched her for 7 years and chosen her anyway. And perhaps that was enough. Perhaps that was more than enough. The wedding took place on a gray January morning in the chapel at Stanhope Park. Snow had fallen overnight, blanketing the grounds in pristine white, and the air inside the ancient stone building was so cold that breath misted before faces, and the candle flames seemed to shiver. The chapel itself was a masterpiece of medieval architecture, all soaring arches and stained glass windows that had witnessed Stanhope weddings for 400 years. Generations of dukes and duchesses had spoken their vows before this altar, their portraits now lining the walls of the main house, their bones resting in the family crypt beneath the flagstone floor. Honoria felt their presence as she entered, not as ghosts or judges, but as witnesses to the continuation of something larger than any individual life. She was becoming part of a legacy that stretched back centuries, and would stretch forward into a future she could barely imagine. She walked down the aisle alone. Her father had declined to attend, claiming illness, though everyone knew it was simply his discomfort with the entire situation. Wearing a gown of ivory silk that the Duke had commissioned from the finest modiste in London. The bodice was fitted close against her body, the skirt sweeping behind her in a train that required 2 housemaids to manage. Seed pearls sewn into the bodice and sleeves caught the candlelight and scattered it in tiny rainbows, making her seem to glow from within. Pearls gleamed at her throat as well, borrowed from the Stanhope collection, a strand that had been worn by every Stanhope bride since the Restoration. And her dark hair was pinned beneath a veil of handmade lace that had been worn by every Stanhope bride for 200 years, delicate as spider silk and more precious than gold. She was 29 years old, walking toward her wedding, and the man waiting at the altar was watching her with an expression that made her heart stop. He looked, she thought distantly, like a man seeing something sacred, something he had waited his entire life to witness. The assembled guests were few. Gideon had no close family, and Honoria had only her sister Louisa, who had come despite her husband's objections, because some ties were stronger than social embarrassment. The pews were filled instead with members of the household staff, who had been invited at Gideon's insistence. Mrs. Palmer dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Jennings maintained his dignity, though Honoria could have sworn she saw his chin tremble when she passed. "Dearly beloved," the vicar began, and the words washed over Honoria in a blur of ritual and response. She spoke her vows clearly, her voice steady, and felt the Duke's hands tremble slightly as he slid the heavy gold ring onto her finger. The ring was old, older than the lace veil, older than the pearl necklace, passed down through generations of Stanhope duchesses. It fit her finger perfectly, as though it had been made for her hand rather than simply altered to accommodate her. "I now pronounce you man and wife." The Duke of Stanhope kissed his bride, and Honoria Bellingham, spinster, failure, expired goods, became the Duchess of Stanhope. She was seen. She was chosen. She was his. The wedding night was nothing like Honoria had expected. She had prepared herself for duty, for the clinical transaction her mother had described in mortifying detail the week before. She had prepared herself to submit, to endure, to perform whatever wifely obligations were required of her with as much dignity as possible. She had not prepared herself for Gideon. He came to her chambers after the guests had departed, still dressed in his wedding clothes, and found her sitting rigid on the edge of the bed in her white nightgown, hands folded in her lap, like a schoolgirl awaiting punishment. "You look terrified," he observed, leaning against the doorframe. "I'm not terrified." Her voice came out slightly higher than usual. "I'm simply prepared." "Prepared?" He pushed off the doorframe and crossed to where she sat, his step slow and deliberate. "Prepared for what, exactly?" "For my duties." The word tasted sour on her tongue. "My mother explained what would be expected of me. I understand that men have needs, and that, as your wife, I am obligated to—" "Stop!" The word was quiet, but commanding. Honoria's mouth snapped shut. Gideon knelt before her, bringing his eyes level with hers, and cupped her face in his hands with the same gentleness he had shown on Lady Ashcroft's terrace. "I did not wait 7 years for you, so that I could claim my marital duties like a creditor collecting a debt." His voice was rough, raw with emotion. "I waited 7 years for this. For you, willing and wanting, in my arms because you choose to be there. Not because of obligation, not because of duty, because you desire me as much as I desire you. I don't." Honoria swallowed hard. "I don't know how to want that. I don't know how to want anything anymore. I've spent so long. I know. He pressed his forehead to hers. I know you have. And I'm asking you to unlearn it. Tonight. And every night after. I'm asking you to stop surviving and start living. She kissed him. It wasn't planned or calculated. It was instinct, raw and desperate. 11 years of loneliness and longing crashing through the walls she had so carefully built. She kissed him, and he responded with a groan that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest, and then his arms were around her, and his body was pressing her back onto the bed, and she stopped thinking about duty or obligation or anything except the feel of him, the taste of him, the overwhelming reality of being wanted. He was patient with her inexperience, tender with her nervousness, gentle when she needed gentleness, and fierce when she discovered she needed that too. He whispered against her skin as he removed her nightgown, words of praise and desire, and something that sounded desperately like love. And when he finally joined their bodies, he watched her face with those silver eyes and told her she was beautiful. For the first time in her life, Honoria believed it. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the dark, her head on his chest, his fingers trailing lazy patterns across her back. Why? She asked, quietly. Why me, really? There must have been someone in all those years who would have been easier, less broken, less complicated. I told you, I was waiting for you to ripen. That's not an answer. He was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was rough with something that sounded like pain. When I was 23, my mother died. He paused, and Honoria felt his chest rise and fall beneath her cheek. She was remarkable, brilliant and fierce and impossible. She married my father for love, which scandalized everyone, and she spent 30 years making Stanhope Park into something worth having. On her deathbed, she made me promise that I would find what she and my father had, that I wouldn't settle for less. And you think I'm that? I think you're the only woman I've ever met who was strong enough to be. His arms tightened around her. The simpering debutantes they threw at me would have crumbled under the weight of this life. They wanted the title, the wealth, the social standing. They didn't want me, didn't even see me beneath all of it. But you, he pressed a kiss to her hair. You've spent 11 years proving you don't need what I can give you, which means if you stay, it's because you want to, because you see something worth staying for. I see you, she said softly, and I have always seen you. He tilted her chin up, making her meet his eyes in the darkness. That's what I've been waiting for, Honoria. Not just a wife, a partner. Someone who sees me as clearly as I see her. Someone who chooses me as fiercely as I choose her. I choose you, she whispered. He kissed her again, slow and deep. And when they came together a second time, it felt less like consummation and more like a promise sealed in flesh. The first test came 3 months later. Honoria had settled into her role as Duchess more easily than she had expected, largely thanks to the staff at Stanhope Park, who had been devoted to Gideon's mother and seemed willing to transfer that devotion to any woman she had raised her son to value. The housekeeper, Mrs. Palmer, took Honoria under her wing with maternal efficiency, teaching her the rhythms of the estate and the preferences of its master. The butler, Jennings, treated her with respectful deference that made her uncomfortable until she realized he genuinely approved of her. But society was a different beast entirely. The ton had accepted Honoria's marriage with grudging fascination. She was, after all, the answer to one of the greatest mysteries in recent memory. But acceptance did not equal approval. There were still whispers when she entered a room, still cutting remarks disguised as compliments, still women who had once dismissed her as invisible and now resented her elevation with a bitterness that bordered on hatred. The Countess of Ashbrook was the worst of them. Lady Ashbrook had been one of the 200 women the Duke had rejected publicly, and according to gossip, somewhat humiliatingly. She had never forgiven him, and when she learned that he had chosen an aging spinster over her accomplished daughter, her fury had crystallized into something cold and calculated. She struck at the first major ball of the season, held at Ashbrook House itself. The invitation had arrived a week prior, elegantly penned on cream-colored paper, bearing the Ashbrook crest. Gideon had stared at it for a long moment, his jaw tight. "We don't have to attend," he said finally. "There are other balls, other ways to establish your place in society. If we don't attend, she wins." Honoria had taken the invitation from his hands and set it on the mantelpiece where the servants would see it. "And I have no intention of letting her win." So they had come, and Honoria had spent hours preparing, not out of vanity, but out of strategy. Every detail of her appearance had been calculated. The deep blue silk gown that brought out the warmth of her complexion, the sapphires at her throat that proclaimed her status as a Stanhope Duchess, the elaborate coiffure that added inches to her already considerable height. She wanted to look powerful. She wanted to look like she belonged. The ballroom at Ashbrook House was designed to intimidate, all soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers and portraits of ancestors gazing down with aristocratic disdain. Hundreds of candles blazed in silver candelabras, their light reflecting off mirrors positioned to maximize the sense of opulence. The cream of London society milled about in their finest attire, and the air was thick with the competing sense of expensive perfume and barely concealed ambition. Honoria attended on Gideon's arm, and she felt his strength beside her like a physical shield. He was dressed in severe black and white, his usual uniform, and the contrast with the more colorfully attired gentlemen around them only emphasized his commanding presence. People noticed when the Duke of Stanhope entered a room. They always had. But tonight, they noticed his wife as well. She felt confident, even beautiful, as they descended the grand staircase and were announced to the assembled guests. "The Duke and Duchess of Stanhope!" The words rang out across the ballroom, and for one perfect moment, Honoria allowed herself to savor them. She was a duchess. She had survived. She had won. And then she heard it. Can you imagine? 29 years old, and not a single proposal before he appeared. Makes one wonder what leverage she had, doesn't it? I heard the Bellinghams were in debt. Perhaps she sold herself for the family honor. Or perhaps she simply caught him in a compromising position, trapped him like a fox in a snare. The whispers were not quiet. They were not subtle. They were loud enough for Honoria to hear, and by the vicious gleam in Lady Ashbrook's eyes across the ballroom, that was precisely the point. Gideon's hand tightened on her arm. She could feel the tension radiating from him, the barely controlled fury of a man watching his wife be publicly humiliated. "I'm going to destroy her," he said quietly, his voice deceptively calm. "No." Honoria placed her hand over his. "You're not. She's testing me." Honoria lifted her chin and smiled, bright and serene, at the watching crowd. "If you defend me, they'll say I can't handle criticism. If you destroy her, they'll say I'm a scheming manipulator who uses you as a weapon. Either way, she wins." "Then what do you propose?" Honoria's smile sharpened. "Watch." She released his arm and walked, not toward the whispering women, not toward Lady Ashbrook, but toward the dance floor, where the orchestra was striking up a waltz. She stopped in the center of the room, alone, and waited. The crowd fell silent. "Your Grace?" A young viscount, barely out of university, looked at her with confusion. "Are you quite well?" "Perfectly well, Lord Pemberton." Honoria's voice carried across the ballroom with a clarity that came from years of being ignored. She had learned to project when she needed to be heard. "I was simply waiting for my husband to claim me for the first waltz. But since he seems hesitant—" She turned to face the crowd, her expression calm. "I suppose I could dance with anyone who's brave enough to stand up with a 29-year-old spinster who trapped a duke through schemes and leverage." The silence was absolute. And then, from across the room, Gideon laughed. It was not a polite laugh. It was a genuine, full-bodied sound of delight that made heads turn and jaws drop. The Duke of Stanhope, the cold, unreachable Duke of Stanhope, was laughing in public, and he was looking at his wife like she had just single-handedly won a war. He crossed the dance floor in 3 long strides, took her hand, and swept her into a waltz that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. "That was magnificent," he murmured, against her ear. "That was necessary." She followed his lead easily, trusting him to guide her through the turns. "They expect me to crumble. They expect me to hide or cry, or let you fight my battles. But I spent 11 years learning to survive their cruelty without either. I'm not going to start depending on you now." "Depending on me isn't weakness, Honoria." "Perhaps not." She met his eyes, and something fierce blazed between them. "But earning their respect on my own terms is strength. And that's what your mother did, isn't it? What she taught you to value." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, really smiled, and pulled her even closer than propriety allowed. "I knew I married the right woman," he said. The whispers didn't stop after that night. Lady Ashbrook didn't suddenly become a friend, or even an ally. But something had shifted, both in how society viewed the new Duchess of Stanhope and in how Honoria viewed herself. She had been invisible for 11 years, overlooked, dismissed, written off as a failure. But invisibility had taught her things that no finishing school could have: how to observe without being observed, how to listen without being heard, how to wait and plan and strike at precisely the right moment. The Ton had expected her to be grateful for her elevation, meek and apologetic for her unexpected good fortune. Instead, she was herself, the same quiet strength that had allowed her to survive, now deployed in service of a new purpose. In the months that followed, Honoria threw herself into her role as Duchess with the same determination that had carried her through 11 failed seasons. She learned the names of every servant at Stanhope Park, all 47 of them, and their families and their concerns. She memorized the estate accounts, surprising the steward with pointed questions about crop yields and tenant relations. She established a school for the children of the workers, teaching basic reading and arithmetic to boys and girls who would otherwise have had no access to education. "You don't have to do all of this, you know," Gideon told her one evening, watching her compile a list of needed repairs for the tenant cottages. "We have staff to handle estate matters. The staff handles the mechanics, but the people need to know that the Duchess sees them, that she cares about their welfare." She looked up from her list, her eyes serious. "I spent 11 years being invisible, Gideon. I know what it feels like to be overlooked by people who have power over your life. I won't do that to anyone in my care." He had crossed the room and kissed her forehead, a gesture of such tender respect that it made her eyes sting with unexpected tears. "My mother would have loved you," he said quietly. "I hope I'm doing her justice." "You're doing more than that. You're exceeding every expectation I had, and believe me, my expectations were high." She became, over the following months, exactly what Gideon had promised she would become: a partner. Not a decorative ornament on his arm, not a breeding mare for his heirs, not a simpering hostess who deferred to his every opinion. A true partner who challenged him when he was wrong and supported him when he was right, and made Stanhope Park into a home rather than a monument. The household staff, initially uncertain about their new mistress, gradually warmed to her practical competence and genuine kindness. Mrs. Palmer, the housekeeper, began seeking her opinion on domestic matters that had previously been decided unilaterally. Jennings, the butler, allowed himself the occasional smile in her presence, a remarkable concession from a man whose facial expressions had previously ranged from grave to slightly less grave. Even the neighboring gentry, initially skeptical of the upstart Duchess, found themselves won over by her refusal to put on airs. She attended their assemblies and joined their charitable committees and listened to their complaints about the weather and the servants and the shocking behavior of young people these days with every appearance of interest. "You're making allies," Gideon observed after one such gathering, where Honoria had spent 2 hours discussing the proper care of roses with an elderly baronet's wife. "I'm making friends," she corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "Allies support you when it benefits them. Friends support you because they care." She slipped her arm through his as they walked back to the carriage. "I've never had many friends. It's rather nice." He covered her hand with his own. "You have me." "Yes." She smiled up at him. "I do." Now, it's important to understand what was happening beneath the surface of this partnership, the currents of feeling that neither of them named, but both of them felt. Gideon had told Honoria from the beginning that he was not offering romance. He had been clear that his interest was practical, calculated, the result of 7 years of observation and assessment. But love, as it turns out, does not much care about declarations of intent. He fell for her slowly, then all at once. It happened during a rainstorm at Stanhope Park, 6 months after their wedding. Honoria had been caught in the downpour while walking in the gardens, one of her habits, even in poor weather, and had returned to the house soaked through, laughing at her own foolishness, her hair plastered to her face, and her gown ruined beyond repair. She had not known he was watching from the library window. He had stood there, transfixed, as she twirled in the rain like a child, her face lifted to the sky, all the careful dignity she wore in public stripped away by the simple joy of being alive. The rain had plastered her gown to her body, revealing curves that her modest clothing usually concealed. Her hair had come loose from its pins and hung in dark waves down her back, and she was laughing, really laughing, with an abandon he had never seen from her before. Something in his chest had cracked open. All the careful distance he had maintained, all the controlled politeness of their partnership, all the respect and admiration he had catalogued as intellectual appreciation. It all dissolved in that moment, replaced by something far more primal. He wanted her, not as a partner or a companion or a duchess, as a woman, as his woman. He wanted to tear that sodden gown from her body and claim her in ways that had nothing to do with contracts or expectations, or the careful negotiations of marriage. He had realized with stunning clarity that this was not partnership or strategy, or the careful fulfillment of his mother's dying wish. This was love. The recognition hit him like a physical blow. Love. He loved her. Not because she met his carefully constructed criteria for a suitable wife, not because she had survived 11 seasons with her dignity intact, not because she was strong enough to stand beside him in society. He loved her because she twirled in the rain, because she laughed when she was alone, because she was, underneath all her armor, the most genuinely joyful person he had ever known. He had stumbled out into the garden like a man possessed, crossing to where she stood, and kissed her in the rain with all the passion he had been carefully containing. "Gideon." She had pulled back, confusion and concern mingling in her eyes. Water streamed down both their faces, making it impossible to tell the rain from the tears he hadn't realized he was shedding. "What? I love you." The words had fallen out of him without permission, raw and honest and terrifying. "I know I said I wasn't offering romance. I know I told you this was practical. But I was wrong, or I was lying, or I simply didn't understand what I was feeling. I love you, Honoria. I think I've loved you since the moment I saw you standing in that ballroom, invisible to everyone but me." She had stared at him, rain streaming down her face, and for a horrible moment, he had thought he had ruined everything. That she would pull away, remind him of their agreement, retreat behind the walls of their partnership, and never let him close enough to touch her heart. Then she had laughed, a sound of pure, unguarded joy, and thrown her arms around his neck. "I love you too, you impossible man," she had said against his lips. "I've loved you since you told me you were waiting for me to ripen." They had stood there in the rain until they were both shivering, kissing and laughing and crying all at once. And when they finally stumbled back into the house, the servants had looked the other way, with knowing smiles. The Duke and Duchess of Stanhope were in love, and society, which had expected their marriage to be a cold arrangement of convenience, had no idea what to make of it. The following spring, Honoria discovered she was with child. The symptoms had been building for weeks, the fatigue, the queasiness, the strange aversions to foods she had always enjoyed. But she had attributed them to the demands of her new role. It wasn't until her maid, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah, who had been with the Stanhope household for 30 years, gently suggested she might want to see a physician, that the truth became impossible to ignore. "You're certain?" Honoria asked Dr. Crawford, her voice barely above a whisper. "Quite certain, Your Grace. I would estimate you're approximately 2 months along. The child should arrive in late summer, if all goes well." If all goes well. The words hung in the air like a warning. Honoria was 29 years old, 30 by the time the child arrived. Old for a first pregnancy. Dangerously old, according to some of the medical literature she had secretly read in Gideon's library. She debated how to tell him, whether to soften the news with caveats about her age and the risks, or simply present the fact and let him draw his own conclusions. In the end, she chose directness, the foundation their entire relationship had been built upon. "I'm pregnant," she said that evening, standing in his study with her hands clasped before her like a servant awaiting judgment. Gideon's reaction to the news was immediate and overwhelming. He swept her into his arms and wept, actually wept, into her hair, murmuring words of love and gratitude and wonder that made her heart ache with tenderness. For a man who had spent so many years alone, who had convinced himself that he would never have what his parents had, the reality of a family of his own seemed almost too much to bear. "A child," he kept saying, pulling back to look at her face, as though seeing it for the first time. "Our child. Honoria, do you understand what you've given me?" "I understand what we've created together," she corrected gently. "This isn't a gift I'm giving you. This is something we made, both of us." "Both of us." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "Yes, both of us. Together." The pregnancy was not easy. Honoria was older than most first-time mothers, a fact that the doctors reminded her of constantly, as though she might have forgotten, and the months that followed were filled with discomfort and worry and occasional moments of genuine fear. The morning sickness lasted well into her 5th month, leaving her pale and shaky and unable to keep down much more than tea and dry toast. Her back ached constantly, a deep, persistent pain that no position could relieve. Her ankles swelled in the summer heat, and she tired so easily that even a short walk in the gardens left her exhausted. But worse than the physical discomfort was the fear, the knowledge, impossible to shake, that women died in childbirth every day, that older women died more frequently than younger ones, that even if she survived the birth, the child might not, or might be born with some defect that she would blame herself for, wondering if she had eaten the wrong thing, or rested too little, or somehow failed to protect the life growing inside her. She didn't share these fears with Gideon. He worried enough already, watching her with anxious eyes whenever she moved too quickly, or winced at a twinge of pain. Instead, she wrote them in a journal she kept hidden in her dressing room, pouring her darkest thoughts onto paper so they wouldn't poison her waking hours. But Gideon was there through all of it, holding her hand through the worst of the sickness, reading to her when she couldn't sleep, hiring the finest physicians in England to ensure her safety. "I cannot lose you," he said one night, his hand pressed against the swell of her belly, feeling the baby kick against his palm. "Either of you, promise me you'll be careful. I promise." She covered his hand with her own. "But I want you to promise something too. Anything. Promise me that if something goes wrong, if there are complications, you'll prioritize saving the child." His face went white. "No, absolutely not. Gideon, I waited 7 years for you." His voice cracked. "I built my entire life around the hope of you. I will not sacrifice you for anything, not even our child. And I spent 11 years being told I was worthless." Honoria met his eyes steadily. "This child, this chance to leave something of myself in the world, is the first thing I've ever had that felt truly mine. If you have to choose the baby." They argued about it for an hour, neither willing to concede. In the end, they agreed to disagree, both secretly hoping the question would never need to be answered. They did not speak of it again. But she saw the fear in his eyes, the way he watched her like a man waiting for the other shoe to drop, and she loved him all the more for it. The labor came in August, on a sweltering day, when the heat pressed down on Stanhope Park like a physical weight. Honoria had been restless all morning, unable to settle, pacing from room to room with a nervous energy she couldn't explain. When the first pain struck, sharp and unmistakable, she was standing by the window in the morning room, watching clouds gather on the horizon. It lasted 18 hours. 18 hours of agony and terror, and Gideon refusing to leave her side despite the midwife's protests that birthing rooms were no place for men. "I'm not leaving her," he growled when they tried to make him go. "She's my wife. I'll be here, whether you like it or not." And he was. Through every contraction, every scream, every moment when Honoria was certain she could not continue, he held her hand and wiped her brow and told her she was the strongest woman he had ever known, the woman he had waited his whole life for, the woman who was going to give him everything he had ever wanted. The baby arrived at dawn, a girl, small and red-faced, and screaming with fury at the indignity of being born. "She's beautiful," Gideon said, his voice breaking. "Honoria, she's perfect." But Honoria didn't answer. Her eyes had closed, her hand gone limp in his, and the midwife was shouting for more linens, and the doctor was calling for instruments, and Gideon felt the world tilt beneath him. "Honoria," he dropped to his knees beside the bed. "Honoria, don't you dare leave me now." The next hours were a blur of blood and fear, and desperate prayers to a God he had never truly believed in. The doctors worked frantically, their faces grim, while Gideon held his newborn daughter and begged his wife to live. She survived. Barely. By the grace of skilled hands and sheer stubbornness. But she survived. The hemorrhaging had stopped. The fever that followed had broken after 3 terrifying days. The doctors, who had gathered around her bedside with grave expressions and careful words, had finally allowed themselves cautious optimism. "She'll need months of rest," Dr. Crawford told Gideon privately. "Complete bed rest, minimal exertion. The body needs time to recover from this kind of trauma. Whatever she needs, whatever it costs, just tell me she'll survive. I believe she will, Your Grace. But it was a very close thing. If your daughter had not come when she did, if the labor had continued much longer." The doctor shook his head. "It's a miracle, frankly. Both of them surviving. A miracle." Yes, that was the word Gideon would use in the years to come, whenever he told the story of his daughter's birth. A miracle that his wife had lived. A miracle that their child was healthy. A miracle that the family he had spent 7 years dreaming of had actually come into being. When Honoria finally opened her eyes 3 days later, weak and pale and fragile as she had never been before, Gideon was sitting beside her bed with their daughter in his arms. The baby was sleeping, tiny fists curled against her chest, her rosebud mouth making small, sucking motions as she dreamed. "You promised," he said roughly, his voice hoarse from 3 days of barely sleeping. "You promised you would be careful." "I was careful." Her voice was barely a whisper, scratchy from disuse. "But you should know by now, I don't give up that easily." He laughed, the sound halfway between relief and a sob. No, you don't." She reached out a trembling hand toward the baby, and Gideon leaned close so she could touch their daughter's downy head. "She's perfect," Honoria breathed. "Gideon, she's absolutely perfect. She looks like you." He pressed a kiss to his wife's forehead, and his cheeks were wet with tears he didn't bother to hide. "She has your stubborn chin. I noticed it the moment she was born. Poor child. She'll need it, being raised by us." He leaned down and kissed her forehead, and when she reached out to touch their daughter's tiny hand, the three of them formed a circle of connection that nothing would ever break. They named her Margaret after Gideon's mother. She had her father's silver eyes and her mother's stubborn chin, and from the moment she entered the world screaming, she owned both her parents completely. 5 years passed. Honoria stood in the gardens of Stanhope Park, watching her daughter chase butterflies through the summer sunshine, and marveled at the impossibility of her own life. She was 34 years old, a duchess, a mother, a wife to a man who still looked at her like she was the answer to every question he had ever asked. The gardens that had once intimidated her with their formal perfection had become her domain, reshaped over 5 years into something warmer and more welcoming. She had added wildflower beds alongside the manicured roses, created a kitchen garden that supplied fresh vegetables to the household, established a small orchard where Margaret loved to climb the apple trees despite her nursemaid's protests. The house itself had changed as well. The cold formality of Gideon's bachelor years had given way to warmth, artwork by local painters, comfortable furniture that invited sitting rather than admiring, books left open on tables because someone was always in the middle of reading something. It was a home now, not a monument, a place where a family lived and laughed and loved. Margaret herself was a force of nature at 5 years old, headstrong, brilliant, utterly convinced that the world would bend to her will if she simply demanded it loudly enough. She had inherited her father's silver eyes and her mother's stubborn chin, along with a combination of their tempers that promised to make her teenage years absolutely exhausting. Honoria could not wait. Behind her, she heard footsteps on the gravel path. "She has your spirit," Gideon said, coming to stand beside her. His hand found hers, fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "Stubborn, fierce, utterly convinced she can do anything she sets her mind to." "She gets that from both of us," he laughed, pulling her close. True enough. They watched their daughter in companionable silence, And Honoria thought about the girl she had been at 29, standing in corners at balls, invisible and overlooked, certain that her life would never be more than survival. Wondering if she would die alone, unmourned and forgotten. Another spinster whose only legacy was the pitying shakes of heads from people who had never bothered to know her. She had been wrong about so many things. Wrong about her own worth, wrong about what she deserved, wrong about the impossibility of being seen, being chosen, being loved. "What are you thinking about?" Gideon asked, his breath warm against her temple. "About Lady Ashcroft's ball, the night we met." "The night you said yes." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "The best night of my life." "I was so afraid," she admitted. "Afraid it was a trick, or a mistake, or a dream I would wake up from. Afraid that I didn't deserve you." "And now?" She turned to face him, reaching up to touch his cheek. His face had softened somewhat over the years of marriage and fatherhood, the harsh angles gentled by happiness. But his eyes were the same, that piercing silver that had seen through all her defenses from the very first moment. "Now I know that deserving has nothing to do with it. Love isn't earned or deserved. It's chosen. You chose me when no one else would. And I choose you, every day, for the rest of our lives." He kissed her then, deep and slow. And when Margaret came running to demand they stop being gross and play with her instead, they laughed and chased their daughter through the garden, 3 figures running through the golden light of a summer afternoon. In the distance, the great house of Stanhope Park stood sentinel over their happiness, no longer a cold monument to aristocratic pride, but a home filled with love and laughter and the certain knowledge that sometimes the things worth having are the things you have to wait for. They called her expired at 29. Said she was past her prime, spoiled goods, destined to die alone and forgotten. But the Duke, who had refused 200 women, had seen something they couldn't. A woman worth waiting for. A woman who needed time to become herself before she could be his. She hadn't been expired at all. She had been ripening. And when she was ready, when life had tested her and tempered her and proven her worth, he had claimed her as his own. That was the real story. Not just of an unlikely marriage or an obsessive duke or a woman who defied all expectations, but of patience and recognition and the kind of love that sees past surfaces to the strength beneath. Honoria Bellingham had spent 11 years being invisible, but she had been seen by the right person at the right time, and that had made all the difference. And as for the Duke of Stanhope, the man who had watched and waited and chosen with such relentless certainty, he never regretted a single moment of those 7 years, because some things, he knew, are worth waiting for. Some people are worth waiting for, and Honoria had been worth every second. Let me pause here to reflect on something important. This story could have ended so many different ways. Honoria could have said no to that first dance, too afraid of drawing attention to herself after so many years of cultivated invisibility. She could have refused his proposal, convinced that such good fortune must be a trap or a joke. She could have let the whispers and the cruelty of women like Lady Ashbrook drive her back into the shadows where society had always wanted her to stay. But she didn't. She chose to be brave. She chose to believe that she deserved love, even after 11 years of being told she didn't. She chose to step into the light, even though it was terrifying and unfamiliar and full of people who wanted to see her fail. And that choice, that single moment of courage at Lady Ashcroft's ball, changed everything. Before you go, I want you to think about something. Have you ever felt like you were past your prime? Like your window of opportunity had closed and the world had moved on without you? Like everyone else had figured out some secret to happiness that you were somehow born without? I hope this story reminds you that timing isn't everything. Sometimes the things worth having need time to develop. Sometimes being late is actually being right on schedule for something better than you could have imagined. Sometimes the people who seem to have it all figured out are just as lost as you are. They're just better at pretending. Honoria Bellingham spent 11 years believing she was worthless. But she wasn't worthless. She was becoming stronger, becoming wiser, becoming the woman she needed to be before she could recognize what she deserved. And when she was finally ready, when she had finally stopped waiting to be saved and started saving herself, the right person appeared. That's not coincidence. That's not luck. That's the universe recognizing that some fruits need time to ripen before they're ready to be picked. Let me know in the comments if this story resonated with you. And as always, thank you for spending this time with me at the Duke's Revenge. Whether it's morning coffee in Melbourne or a late night in London, your presence here means everything. Until next time.